Hello, and welcome to today's American Nuclear Society event on international perspectives on the role of nuclear energy in a net zero future. I'm Craig Piercy, the Executive Director and CEO of ANS, and I'll be serving as the moderator for this panel session. Having just gotten back from the IAEA General Conference and with COP28 on the horizon, I'm excited about this conversation. More and more people around the world in positions of leadership are bringing a practical, problem-solving mindset to the net zero challenge. And the math is clear. Without nuclear, getting to net zero will be an exercise in global energy deprivation that's destined to fail. Today, we explore the opportunities and the headwinds of this new resurgence of global interest in nuclear energy that promises a healthier planet without sacrificing our shared prosperity or our human development objectives. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a couple of quick notes regarding today's events. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A function of Zoom. I will attempt to address as many of them as possible. The event will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed to event registrants later today. And additionally, certificates of attendance for the event are available by request. Please see the chat for contact information. And finally, we ask that all participants adhere to the ANS Code of Ethics and Respectful Behavior Policy during this event, which can be held and found at ans.org. So with those notes out of the way, I'd like to introduce today's panelists. Lee Beck is the Clean Air Task Force's Senior Director in Europe and the Middle East, leading their climate strategy to advance a broad portfolio of solutions in both regions. She is also responsible for advancing CATF's efforts on global climate policy stage through their presence at COP28. Karl Hausker is a senior fellow in the World Resource Institute's climate program. He leads analysis and modeling of net zero emission pathways and leads work on electricity market design. He served as an expert reviewer for the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. Staffan Qvist is the CEO of Quantified Carbon Limited, an international consultancy firm dedicated to supporting decarbonization of energy systems and industrial processes. He's also a managing director at DeepSense, a technology due diligence provider to deep tech investors. And finally, last but not least, Alina Teplinsky is Pillsbury's global energy industry leader, hydrogen practice co-leader, and is the leading member of the firm's international nuclear projects team. So with that, we're going to go in a particular order, and I'm going to ask Karl Hausker to go ahead, unmute your video, and we're going to start with about 5 or so minutes of opening remarks, each of our participants, starting with Karl. And Karl, talk to us a little bit about where things stand with the IPCC. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Craig. I'm going to flip through a couple of slides quickly here to give you a sense of the treatment of nuclear power in the IPCC's 6th Assessment Report. And I'll throw in a little observation at the end on the treatment of nuclear in the recently released FCCC Global Stocktake Report. I have good news and bad news. The good news is in the full 2,000-page IPCC mitigation report, there was, I think, a fair and objective treatment of nuclear and its role in the mitigation scenarios that can keep us to 1.5 or 2 degrees. The bad news is that role and that finding was not communicated really in the summary for policymakers of the mitigation report, which is what most people read. So I'm going to take you into the depths of the 2,000-page report first and show you a key table. This is from a table TS2 in the technical summary of the mitigation report, showing the growth in primary energy sources that replace coal and oil and gas, which, as you know, must decrease sharply over the next 30 years. And what this table does is summarize the mitigation scenarios and the roles of the growth of nuclear, modern biomass and the non-biomass renewables like solar, wind, and hydro, and their growth from 2019 to 2030 and on to 2050. So when we look in this first column at the 1.5 degree scenarios, we find that the median value of nuclear growth by 2030 is 40% over current levels, and by 2050, 90% over current levels. And similar growth, slightly slower as one moves from left to right in this table, moving from 1.5 to 2 degree scenarios. Below that, you'll also see the aggressive growth needed in modern biomass, as well as solar and wind and hydro. But this clearly shows that nuclear has an important role in terms of the growth of primary energy. The second key figure in the IPCC report is this one, figure 6.30, chapter 6 of the mitigation report. It shows depictions of the key elements of the electricity generation mix for three categories: solar and wind grouped together on the left, CCS and electricity in the middle, and nuclear on the right-hand side. In each case, the vertical axis showing the percent of global electricity production, and on the x-axis showing a decadal snapshot of that share from 2020 to 2050. And moving from left to right, first we see that solar and wind are likely to grow from roughly 10% of the global generation currently to perhaps 50, 60, or 70% by 2050, consistent with much other modeling that shows that these sources can become a major component of the grid. In the middle, we see that CCS and electricity currently essentially zero, just a couple of demo plants, that it may grow to 5 or 10% of the global generation mix by 2050, again, with wide variation in these bars representing what's called the interquartile range of where these modeling scenarios come out. And then of greatest interest to ANS is on the right side, we see the role of nuclear. Currently about 10% of global electricity production. And interestingly, the scenarios show that share perhaps being maintained at 10% or perhaps growing to 15 or 20%, again, with a large range. But it's very important to note that total electricity generation must double or triple over the next 30 years to electrify the economy, to produce fuels like hydrogen and ammonia, and probably to run technological carbon dioxide removal, such as DAC. And so even if nuclear were to maintain a simple 10% share, in absolute terms, it would need to double or triple by 2050. So that's the good news, that the IPCC report documents that nuclear has an important role to play. Unfortunately, the 2,000-page report gets boiled down to roughly a 40-page summary for policymakers, which is what most people read. And here you will find that nearly all references to nuclear power are strangely removed. When nuclear power appears on a short list of low carbon or zero carbon electricity sources in the full report, here highlighted in yellow, we find that in the SPM, nuclear disappears off of that list, and the paragraph or the sentence is rephrased in the way that I show on this slide. The word nuclear only appears in a laundry list of options for 2030 in not very flattering light, and once in a negative reference to its, quote, high upfront costs, unquote. But again, that's not exactly unique to nuclear here. So I find it disappointing and ultimately distorting for the SPM to drop references to nuclear compared to the, I think, fair and objective treatment it receives in the full report. A final note, as many of you know, a couple of weeks ago, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change released the Global Stocktake Report to guide negotiators going into COP28. And here I unfortunately want to note that it pulled in some very similar language from the Workgroup 3 report on how to achieve net zero CO2 energy systems. And in fact, the stocktake report draws very heavily on the IPCC. However, where the IPCC referred to the need for zero carbon electricity, which is a rather broad category and inclusive category, the stocktake report substituted the phrase renewable energy for zero carbon electricity, a significant narrowing of the meaning of that. The key paragraph here in the report is 115, which I quote there. So that's a whirlwind tour of how the IPCC report and the Global Stocktake report dealt with nuclear. I'd be happy to handle any questions on that, and I will have a paper coming out on this fall. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Karl. Look forward to asking you a couple questions. So I do want to turn now to Lee Beck, and Lee, you're really keeping a close eye on COP28, upcoming here, really in just a little over a month. Tell us what you see.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. And Karl, really excited about your paper going forward. So thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for the INS for having me here today. And thanks to all of our audience for joining us. For those of you who don't know, the Clean Air Task Force is a global climate and environmental NGO focusing on overlooked solutions at the heart or the nexus of energy access, energy security, and climate. So nuclear is one of them, but other technologies we work on are also carbon capture, hydrogen, clean energy infrastructure, methane, next generation tech like fusion, and super hot rock geothermal in the US, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And as you just said it, Craig, we're just a few weeks away from COP28. So I'd really like to focus on the roadmap from COP27 last year in Egypt to COP28 and why COP28 actually presents a unique opportunity to really accelerate and create momentum around nuclear. I think it's really important, and Craig, you talked about this a little bit in your introductory remarks, to really think through what and to situate the scale up of nuclear in the global context. I think the global energy crisis, which is still ongoing, has really sensitized the awareness around the need for energy supply. And at the same time, we need to remember, right, there's a billion people that don't have access to electricity today. We're expecting electricity to be the primary vector of decarbonization. And so the grid is expected to be 3 times to 4 times as big as it is today to provide 24/7, 365 clean electricity. And I think increasingly governments and countries around the globe are thinking through how they can really get to clean baseload. I'm right now here actually in Poland, which has 67% of coal on the grid, but it's also really making promising steps towards nuclear. And so as kind of the climate narrative becomes situated within the realities of economic and energy security, it has become really evident that nuclear is actually part of the solution. Of course, there's still opponents. There's a lot of political horse trading around it, particularly in Europe, seeing Germany and France, for example. But at COP28, we had for the first time multiple pavilions and multiple large events on nuclear. There were multiple very high-profile announcements, particularly from the US government. And also the final text really had a big nod to technology optionality, which I think dovetails with what you said, Karl. And so since then, there has been really this accumulation of political will towards nuclear. On Friday at the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency, more than 20 countries, as many as not in a long time, have signed a key declaration on progressing nuclear, including new and embarking countries, so countries that are going to deploy nuclear in the future or haven't done so in a generation. EU Commissioner von der Leyen, as well, Executive Vice President von der Leyen and Commissioner Breton have spoken out about the need for financial and policy support for nuclear. Again, something something really, really important and unprecedented. And then the European Parliament right this second is actually investigating what benefits, for example, SMRs could deliver for European energy security. So I think in short, there's been a really, particularly in Europe, unexpectedly, a huge political momentum towards COP28. And so thinking about the UAE, of course, which is also a nuclear leader, there's a real opportunity to leverage this global momentum to catalyze a pragmatic and global strategy for deploying nuclear globally. I think what's really needed for this technology, along with other kind of, more innovative or more emerging solutions, is really to a pathway to deliver steel in the ground. While challenges remain, it's really, really important that we can show that it can be done, that it can be done on time, that it can be done on budget across multiple regions. And so this is, for us, we're looking at COP28 and we're seeing multiple stakeholders really, and I think we're going to talk about this more today, really create the regulatory, financial, and technical infrastructure that can enable this accelerated economic and safe scale up of nuclear. So there are several stakeholders are already setting their eyes on this. INEC from the UAE and the World Nuclear Association have launched the Net Zero Nuclear Initiative to push for a 3x expansion, up from 400 gigawatts today. I think Clean Air Task Force's own analysis actually thinks we need a little bit more scale up, between 50 to 100 gigawatts annually. But it really is about deploying nuclear in countries that either haven't built anything in a generation or have never built nuclear before. So it's really, really important to situate this scale up in the unique circumstances based on preferences, resources, and capabilities. So from our perspective, we really need to create an options-based pathway to scale up nuclear. And so we have identified a range of challenges which we would like to see discussed and investigated with really diverse set of stakeholders from industry, from governments, from NGOs at COP. And so these are the need for project execution and capacity building. So really, how can we plan new facilities in the most streamlined and improved way specified for a local context, but also in a way that we can actually commercialize the technology, so reduce costs by learning by doing. There's a lot to do on the regulatory system development and harmonization globally, and would also already be a big step to do it across multiple countries. Obviously, financing, deploying capital for next generation technologies in a way is really a really difficult question. It requires us to think through innovative business models, potentially borrow from other technologies, but also reduce risk, for example, through procurement, government procurement, government backing. I think there's a lot of room for policy improvement, particularly outside the United States. Non-proliferation, nuclear security, always a question where I think more needs to be done. Other questions that have come up, particularly, for example, here in the context of Poland, is workforce development. How can we really make sure that we're creating a workforce that is capable of the administrative burden that requires the nuclear scale up for new countries, but also the technical way, and then, of course, the long-term kind of nuclear industry scale up in new places globally. And then finally, of course, the question of spent nuclear fuel management. So there's a lot of pieces that have to fall into place for these large infrastructure projects to really come together at scale. And it's, I think, time to really think through how this can be done in a coordinated and efficient way globally. So we hope that COP28 can be the kickstart for this really important conversation.
Well, thank you, Leigh. Look forward to coming back to you with questions as well. But now I want to turn to Alina Teplinsky, well known in the nuclear community as someone who's been involved in nuclear deals all over the world and really has a great perch from which to sort of view the evolution of the international nuclear enterprise. Alina, what do you say?
Well, thank you, Craig. Well, I'm going to zoom in a little bit from what Leigh was discussing on a global scale and give you some examples how we see policies in individual countries really changing and supporting the inclusion of nuclear in sustainable development roadmaps and strategies, taxonomies, and also incentives. So if we just look at our neighbor in the north, Canada, Canada has really made a remarkable turn in its support for nuclear power. Canada, of course, has always had, a solid a nuclear industry with the operation of CANDUs. But what's happened in Canada over the past 3 years is really remarkable, both on refurbishing existing reactors, providing incentives, and also looking to develop SMRs. One remarkable development to me in 2021, Bruce Power issued green bonds to refurbish its reactors. It was the very first time that a green bond was issued for something related to nuclear construction and nuclear finance. So that in itself was a big step and a big kind of show to the world, that nuclear is in fact green, is in fact sustainable. Canada historically hasn't really provided much government finance to nuclear outside of what Bruce Power and OPG already do. But the Canadian Infrastructure Bank announced a commitment of more than $700 million towards the OPG Darlington New Nuclear Project, which is going to be, at this point, initially was one BWRX 300, now it's going to be 4. And then similar to what we're seeing in the United States, Canada has also passed a number of incentives that put nuclear on the same level playing as other clean energy technologies. So there is an investment clean electricity tax credit for nuclear projects, both large scale and SMRs. There is an investment tax credit for clean technology manufacturing, which specifically includes nuclear energy. And then you have all of this hydrogen investment planned in Canada. And Canada's hydrogen roadmap specifically includes production of hydrogen from both large reactors and SMRs through pretty much every pathway. So Canada is a really good example. And Canada has a liberal government, which traditionally hasn't been, the most keen on nuclear, but has provided, a significant amount of support for nuclear. If we go across the pond to the UK, now the UK is a government that has been sort of singing songs about the need for new nuclear for a long time, but really hasn't done much. In fact, there have been several projects that didn't move forward for lack of government support and government investment, which were really well positioned to add clean energy to the UK grid. The last 2 years, really since the invasion of Ukraine, things have completely changed in the UK as far as government support. Nuclear has been specifically included in the UK's sustainable taxonomy, which about 2 years ago was not going to be the case. We've seen direct government investments for the very first time, 700 million pounds for the UK government to become a partner with EDF and Sizewell C. We've got 120 million future nuclear enabling fund, this SMR competition that's moving really quickly, that potentially is 20 billion pounds, lots of grants, lots of support for nuclear. So the UK government is finally, walking the walk in instead of just talking about nuclear, understanding that, really needs nuclear for its clean energy strategy. If you look to Asia, some really interesting developments there as well. One of the most fascinating ones has been Korea, how quickly things have flipped. So several years ago, the administration of President Moon took Korea, which was very pro-nuclear and actually, really a success story for a country that, started with nothing in the 1970s and became, a pretty amazing nuclear exporter with the very successful Baraka project. And the administration decided to phase out nuclear. And Korea lost a significant amount of its capability because of that policy. President Yoon, who came into the Blue House last year, set the goal to reinstate Korea's policy that supports nuclear. In fact, Korea is now planning to restart the construction of 6 reactors, raise nuclear energy's contributions to the power mix to 35%, invest into R&D, and also focus on exports. I think even potentially more interesting is Japan. Japan, of course, sadly suffered so much from the Fukushima nuclear incident, and has been really slow in restarting existing reactors and hasn't really invested much into R&D in the nuclear space. For energy security as well as sustainability reasons, the Japanese green growth strategy now includes nuclear. So it's trying to facilitate the restarts of about 21, 22 reactors in the next couple of years, but also looks to investment in research and development and deployment for SMRs. And I was in Japan, spent about 10 days there in July, and you could really see companies finally starting to talk about nuclear, invest into nuclear, and get excited about nuclear again, which is great because Japan has really been traditionally a powerhouse in the nuclear industry. So that's kind of a snapshot of some of the developing nations, some of the developed nations. But if we look at the developing world, the task is even greater. You look at a country like India, the country is 55% dependent on coal for its energy needs. And it currently consumes about less than 1/10. Each person in India consumes less than 1/10 of energy than somebody in a similar position in the United States. So India is really, underperforming for its population, for sustainable development, but also for its industry. So it's got the double task of needing to decarbonize, become less reliant on coal, and to have sustainable development. And India has been building up its nuclear capacity domestically with its indigenous reactors, but now India is also looking to SMRs, potentially tens of gigawatts of SMRs to try to replace some of its coal capacity and support its industry. Indonesia, very similar position, 43% dependent on coal in the country's energy mix. It's got lots of places that, really require sustainable development. Also has been talking about nuclear for a very long time, but hasn't really done much. But now we see this government making some firm plans to develop small modular reactors. And then you have other countries. I think Ghana is a great example. I've spent a lot of time talking to industrial companies in Ghana, including the association of industrial interests there. And what they've told me is that Ghana really needs firm, clean electricity on the grid by early 2030s, or its existing industry will simply collapse. It's already barely hanging by a thread. There is insufficient power to power existing industry, and Ghana has a lot of potential for new industry, and that potential is going unrealized because they don't have access to firm, clean, reliable sources of energy. So Ghana is also making, very specific plans to deploy new nuclear, still deciding between large reactors and SMRs, but has firmly decided that it needs nuclear for sustainable development. And I'll mention one other interesting example, the country of El Salvador, a very small country about the size of the state of Massachusetts in Central America, dear to my heart because my husband's from there. But El Salvador historically hasn't really looked at nuclear since about the 1960s when everyone was looking at nuclear, because it's very rich in hydro and it's got a lot of geothermal. The country has about 15 volcanoes. But this year, El Salvador decided that they need nuclear as well. They're looking at SMRs because they want to be able to provide firm, clean energy to its population, but also to be able to build up industry, especially tech industry in El Salvador, which is very energy hungry. So even a country that, traditionally has not needed a type of source like nuclear is now looking at nuclear. Rosy picture, right? But we still have so many gaps. I think the EU is really interesting. Lee talked about a lot of the positive developments in the EU, and that is true. If you look at the map of the EU, the countries that are pro-nuclear or looking at nuclear seriously by far outnumber the countries that are not, which is pretty much limited to Germany, Austria, Luxembourg, and Spain is kind of, on the cusp of it. But those countries have an outsized influence in EU politics. And if you look at all of the targets in the EU, Fit to 55, the hydrogen targets, everything is basically set out for renewable generation only. And nuclear has been thankfully included in the sustainable taxonomy, but it has been labeled as transitional only really because of politics and because sustainable was defined to mean renewable only. So still a lot of work to be done in the EU, the European Commission level, and European Parliament to actually show the voice of the countries that are pro-nuclear and developing nuclear, which currently is not shining through as much if you look at overall EU policies. And then when we look at, one of the drivers, Lee mentioned already financing, one of the drivers in enabling nuclear, especially in the developing world, but also in the developed world, has been done traditionally for other energy sources, multilaterals. So in the developing world, almost every clean energy project or energy projects, period, are financed by the World Bank or one of the regional banks. None of these institutions, with the exception of the European Investment Bank, finance nuclear. They all have policies that exclude nuclear the same way that financing terrorism is excluded. So not a good club to be in. EIB does finance nuclear, but doesn't in fact do much because it doesn't really see nuclear as fitting within its risk profile. So there really need to be solutions to change those policies, but also think of other transformative ways to change this, to fill in the gaps. So, for example, I'm involved with an initiative to create basically a World Bank for nuclear called the International Bank for Nuclear Infrastructure that would finance nuclear, not just reactors, but also supply chain, back end, everything that's related to scaling nuclear to the levels needed for sustainable development, climate change mitigation, and energy security. So still a lot of work to be done, but overall the picture is looking pretty positive.
Thanks, Alina. Again, we'll get to questions really soon, but before we do, I want to ask Staffan to turn on his camera. And Staffan, you've spent a lot of time working specifically on the coal to nuclear transition. The anchor speaker always has the hardest job because everyone else usually says a lot of the things that person wanted to say. But I'll turn it over to you because I'm interested to hear what you've been working on.
Yeah, and I can't blame that no one mentioned coal to nuclear, so I'm on my own. I will try to share my screen. If someone could give a thumbs up whether this works or not, or
We do. We have it.
Yep. Okay, wonderful. Great to be with you, everyone. I was asked to be the last speaker because I had a positive message, so I'm going to try to give a positive message, maybe some uplifting thing, although I think Alina had a lot of positive news to share as well. This will be a teaser of a particular project that I've been involved in for the last 4 years called Repower. You may have heard of this in some incarnation, but I'll show what we've been doing, and really happy to answer questions and critique or objections to these ideas. So Repower is a project that was started about 4 years ago now, a little bit less than 4 years ago, when an environmental NGO called Environmental Defense Fund asked me, actually we discussed together a project of looking at the stranded assets in fossil fuels. If and when we do decarbonize, we have built a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure in various ways. What will happen to all that equipment was the original question. Is there any value in that, or should it just be decommissioned and scrapped and stranded? And the investments into this stranded. So that was the research question. That blossomed in several incarnations since then. So we were initially funded to look at this by the Environmental Defense Fund, then by the Quadrature Climate Foundation, now by Founders Pledge. And we are in the middle of a 2-year program looking at this. I was supposed to give a very big announcement today as the first time ever about a new partner joining the initiative. And I will give that announcement, but I have to keep it anonymous, unfortunately, because we still haven't gotten approval from the comms team of that institution to publicly give out a press release. I think it will come maybe tomorrow. So look at this space, let's say. But one of the largest financial institutions in the world, top 10 World Bank, is joining the initiative. And they have committed to financing on the order of $1 trillion into decarbonization projects globally by 2050. So it's not insignificant, new partner to the initiative. So we are looking at in everything we do, but particularly in this project, this challenge quite succinctly, let's say, stated is decarbonization is about two things: building stuff and closing stuff. And that is a huge problem, especially the timing of how you do that. You don't want to build a parallel power system, for example, next to your old one, and then shut down the old one. That is quite expensive. And you very, very much certainly don't want to shut down your existing one and then build a new one. The repower idea is essentially trying to figure out how you can do this in one go. So you get rid of the old stuff that you don't want, or at least you don't want it operating that way, and you get the new stuff as you're doing it, one for one like. So the questions that the project was asking in late 2019, when we started, was, can we just decarbonize, but avoid stranding all the investments we'd made, or some fraction of the investments we made at least, avoid firing all the people that work at these places, all the fossil fuel power plants, for example, avoid abandoning these sites and equipment. And crucially, while doing that, can we also still provide all of the critical services that these power plants provide? It's not as if they're, not valuable things, even though they emit CO2 and air pollution. They're extremely valuable for our economies and for our lives. So can we do number one and number two at one time? Can they continue to do what they're doing for the power grid, for the heating systems, for the local economies? Is there a way to do that, essentially, was the research question. And we focus on coal power plants because coal power plants are both the most polluting power plants and the largest form of electricity generation in the world. And they are surprisingly young, which means they are surprisingly sticky if you don't do anything about them. Because if you've invested a lot of money very recently in a plant that cost a few $1 billion, you're not likely to want to walk away from that investment very easily. And in areas that we've been looking at in the world, the average age of coal power plants is less than 10 years, in some regions 7 years, especially in some regions in China. And average over the world, it's less than 20 years capacity average. And these assets obviously can run for 40, 50 years, well maintained. So are we to scrap all of this, strand all the trillions invested, and fire all the workers? We think that's not probably not a good idea, and it's also not a good story. It's not a part of a just transition. So we're hoping we can do this in some other way, and particularly, focus for the more technically interesting options of this is the very new coal power plants. So something like 1.4, 1.3 terawatt of installed capacity in the last 15 years, 3,400 units, 1,300 new large sites established for coal power plants. We would see numbers like this for nuclear. I think everyone would be elated, and that's where we need to get to, I guess. So there's a wide suite of options with varying technology readiness levels and timelines that we've explored. The one that I will focus on today, because this is American Nuclear Society, is the nuclear pathway, which is one of the most promising ones and one of the ones we've done the most work on. So repower and repurpose existing fossil fuel power plant sites with new heat sources, such as nuclear. There's a lot of other things that I don't have time to go through, but we are also looking at all of them. So the program is not a nuclear program in any way. It's a technology neutral program for clean energy, of which obviously, and of course, nuclear is part of the clean energy family. So I'm hearing I don't hear any of you, you're all muted, but I still hear in many places a bunch of sighs. What is this guy talking about? Coal power plants are old, rusty, dirty things that you don't want to touch with a 100-foot pole or a 1,000-foot pole, and you wouldn't want to hook up a new fancy reactor to any of that equipment. Sounds like a terrible idea. In some cases, that's absolutely right, and I would agree. In some cases, that's not entirely right. It depends on the state and the condition of the coal power plant. What we are looking at is a menu of options of reuse or repurposing existing sites from. If you have a brand new plant and you have a brand new, established reactor concept, for example, that can come in and make the same steam, temperature, and pressure as the coal boiler did, full repowering, actually reusing that equipment is a viable pathway, but it's not going to happen everywhere. It's not going to happen at your local coal power plant in the US, most likely, because most of them are very old. So what you can do then is go down one step in the ladder and do partial repowering. So maybe you reuse the grid connection, which is extremely valuable, not just in money, but in time and permitting. and in opposition or lack of opposition because it's already there. You have cooling water permits because coal power plants are thermal power plants. You are allowed to take in water and heat it up and release it back, which is a terrible permit to try to apply for. And you have a lot of other things going with it that's very good, including a local workforce that really wants to keep working somewhere, and a local economy that really wants to have investments rather than decommissioning and depopulation. At the very lowest rung of the ladder is just repurposing the site itself. Unlikely to happen, I think, because the grid connections will probably be reused as well. But all of these options are analyzed. The most fun one, obviously, is the full repowering one, where you turn a coal power plant into a nuclear plant. In this example, you likely want to have what's called an advanced reactor or a high temperature reactor to be able to make steam of the same conditions a coal boiler would do, to be able to reuse the whole plant. And as I said, I'm happy to fight anyone in the questions and comments about how stupid that idea is. On the face of it, it might seem stupid if you have a local coal plant in mind that is very old and rusty, but that is not the state of the global coal power plant fleet. So the idea does have some legs, but it's very geographically dependent. This is some nice pictures of how a full repowering process would work. To the left, you have a coal power plant. In the middle, we are building the replacement heat source. And to the right, the ground suddenly turned green instead of gray because it's not an emitting power plant anymore. But most of the equipment that was there is still in use. Most of the people that work there are still employed. And the local economy can benefit from this plant for the next 60 to 80 years. So this is kind of what hasn't happened yet, but will happen in some sense. Some part of this, at least, will happen in some projects that are actually underway now. Obviously, no one is doing reusing steam turbines and things, but at least site repurposing and power plant worker retraining is happening in several places, including in the US with the TerraPower's project in Wyoming. So highlights of this, then, we have done a bunch of papers on this. We've done a bunch of studies. We have a couple of websites that people can look at and a tool that people can play around with. But on the highest level, if this is really adopted as a big idea, 200 billion tons of CO2 emission reductions, we can save probably up to 2/3, maybe half, maybe up to 2/3 of the local power plant workforce, depending on how you repower, obviously. It's not just going to be nuclear. It's going to be a range of options. Obviously, you have a just transition angle where you do have, instead of local opposition to decarbonization, extreme local support, because this is an opportunity, not a threat. You can save money, quite a lot of money in actual cash, but also a lot of money not wasted or not spent on permitting processes that you don't need to go through. So the last two are kind of connected. So if someone is very interested in this and says, I'm not sure about this sounds a bit sketchy, we do have a bunch of peer-reviewed papers that you can look at and give you more detail than I can do on this. Also, we have a website, repower.world, if anyone's interested in reading more about this. And new, not announced yet, but announced now. At least I got one announcement out. Not as exciting as the financial institution joining, but anyway, there is a website now out in beta form called Repower Score, where we try to rank the suitability of various coal plants around the world, essentially all coal plants around the world and all coal power plant units around the world for repowering of various types. So I've zoomed in on the US. So you can go there right now and play around with your local coal power plant to see how suitable this algorithm currently thinks it is. It's not perfect. It's probably not even completely correct. That's why I want to talk about this and have people join. I know there's 330 people listening now. If you have something to improve on this, please play around. Please help us. Please let us improve it together. Thank you. I don't know how I did on time, but sorry if I went overboard, Craig.
Staffan, you did just great. So I'm going to ask our other panelists to go ahead and turn on their camera and unmute themselves, and we're going to start into our roundtable discussion, and then we'll move to audience questions. So, Karl, I want to start with you. You essentially talk about how in the IPCC report itself, nuclear is becoming more and more prominently, is fairly prominently featured. And yet in the SPM, the references for nuclear go away. Are the are the numbers going away in the SPM report, or is it simply a matter of we're not using the word nuclear because we know it offends certain people's sensibilities, but the sort of the underlying data on what's needed doesn't change? How, is this purely a political thing, or do the numbers change as well?
Mhm. I believe it is purely a political thing. The numbers and analysis are solid in the 2,000-page report, but in the process of creating the summary for policymakers, which is a process that involves governments signing off word for word on that summary, for some reason, that process resulted in almost no references to nuclear power and its role. And thus, in my personal view, and I'm just speaking not for WRI, but as an individual analyst, I think this is a distortion of the underlying Workgroup 3 report findings.
Yeah. So, and that, which is a perfect lead into a question for you, Lee, which is, we've seen this in the past where there is this hesitancy to say the word, to get the agreements that come out of COP conforming with what we know needs to be done. Where do you see things now, and where are the opportunities in this COP to make some changes?
Yeah, thanks so much for this question. And I think it's really important to move on from this politicization of solutions to really essentially think of climate change mitigation as a risk management challenge. The more solutions we have at scale available, the higher chance of achieving decarbonization. And this is particularly relevant if we're thinking of each country or region with different needs for resources and decarbonization pathways, right? And so I think that what's been happening at the COP and COP27, I think was a good example. We moved to Egypt, right? Away from the West. There was a more robust conversation around technologies that had historically been excluded. Carbon capture and storage is one example, oil and gas decarbonization another. So we're talking now about the hard sectors to decarbonize. So nuclear also, of course, came up in this conversation. And I think this will continue, especially as we're talking about global decarbonization and moving into a new frame of we need all solutions as fast as possible. What I would like to see happen, or what Clean Air Task Force really would like to see happen, is moving from pledges to plans at this COP, right? So we're seeing the 3x nuclear pledge, we're expecting other pledges, but what we'd like to see is concrete steps from governments and industry to really figure out how can we actually deliver these pledges at scale. What are the key policy mechanisms, the funding needs, the infrastructure needs, really understanding what kind of infrastructure do we need to deliver on the energy transition. And then the other piece that I think is really, really important is reframing the electricity decarbonization question away from renewables versus say from low carbon power to 24/7, 365 clean electricity, and then really thinking through what's the least cost electricity mix that we can build to deliver that, in addition to thinking through that. And I think, Alina, you put it so well, electricity is the main decarbonization vector. Again, means we're going to use it to produce hydrogen, electrification of transportation. So it's really this central node. And so I think this question has to come up. So what I'd also like to see, I think, is large electricity consumers. And we've seen Google put out papers on firm low carbon power. We've seen 24/7 really gain traction as a concept in the United States. But I'd like this to be kind of diffuse globally. It's really those actors coming to the table and thinking through what could be an order book approach for multiple of a single technology to really show that we can't just build one. We need to build multiple to harvest costs and efficiencies and experience. So I think this is, in my mind, the real next steps is countries and electricity consumers coming together and thinking as where can we deliver multiple SMRs or multiple reactors to really show that it can be done, and that it can be done on time and on budget. We need to move on from the political conversation.
Right, right. I still wonder whether we have to, do we have to make people say the word, right? I think that really is the, sort of one of the questions I have coming into COP. But what you said, Lee, leads directly to you, Alina, because, clearly the U.S. wants to be a constructive partner in the dialogue at COP and is, I think, let's give credit where credit is due. I think this administration and these recent Congresses have really accepted the need for U.S. to be involved. Like that conversation has changed in a positive way. But there are the old headwinds, right? The old headwinds that we know. U.S. is not a vertically integrated nuclear enterprise, and you have 10 different agencies that all need to be involved in some way or another, and 123 agreements and 810s that you put enough barnacles on the hull and the U.S. nuclear enterprise can't move fast enough to catch its foreign competitors. What's your sense of where we are, and are we making progress in breaking down some of those barriers and covering the headwinds that have been there? Or should we be optimistic?
Man, we definitely have a lot of reason to be optimistic. Like you said, Craig, there's significant support in Washington for nuclear power. I think unprecedented. It's really bipartisan, which is also unprecedented. The amount of money and incentive that have been ushered in to support nuclear, once again, unprecedented, so lots of support. But we still have gaps. I think in particularly we have gaps in getting the firm demand for the new reactors and getting those first demos done in a way that will enable more reactors to be built and be built quickly. So I think what's been happening is that we've been sort of chipping away at this, big obstacle that we have in getting nuclear to scale. And we've been making progress, but, we still have, like you said, some headwinds here and there. And unless you solve all the pieces of the puzzle, you still have issues like licensing, right? We can't get Part 53 done. And that's not an immediate issue because I think everyone's going through parts 50, 52, but that is going to be an issue in scale. The financing issue that I mentioned, LPOs got money can't give away, right? Because we're still missing equity for new nuclear, and we're still concerned about cost overruns. And we're sort of still relying on the existing utilities, which are, just conservative and are not, best positioned to be the demonstrators of new technology. So we have to figure out how to get other industries incentivized, like Lee mentioned, all the industries that are heavy electricity users, but also ones that are industrial users. We've got Dow now as a project that's great, but we need, at least 10 other Dows or oil and gas companies. So I think we need to think holistically and have kind of an all government strategy to figure out, what exactly are the gaps and how can we close them as soon as possible, because otherwise we're going to end up with too slow of a deployment or potentially projects that don't move forward successfully, which would undermine all of the investment and all of the supports that have provided to date.
So Staffan, let me turn to you for a second. So appreciated the presentation and interested in sort of the taxonomy of repowering coal plants. And I guess especially in those sort of the more intensive, like full repowering to another source, nuclear could play a role there. And obviously you mentioned TerraPower and the work that they're doing in Kemmerer, Wyoming. But can you talk to me more generally? Are you seeing nuclear vendors beginning to contemplate this and do some maybe even just preliminary engineering work on what it would take to accomplish that sort of max option? What are you seeing from the industry side?
I would say there are a number of them moving in that direction, and it's quite clear to me that the technical solution for that, like the technical implementation of how this would happen, if that would happen, the full repowering, is very similar to what TerraPower is doing with the Natrium design. So what you need is an interface between a reactor and the equipment at a coal power plant that you might want to reuse. It's very difficult to match up a reactor directly into a coal power plant. You would have to be very lucky with parameters for that to work. So the intermediate thermal energy storage system that is an integral part of the TerraPower design, anyone who has that is not a very technically difficult thing to add to your design if you're doing an advanced reactor, and it makes sense. That kind of technology, I think, would be key for these full kind of repowerings to happen, because it gives you design flexibility. It allows you, for example, to go in with a reactor with a thermal power rating lower than the coal power plant had in its steam, it's in its conventional side, giving you that flexibility of being able to run the cheaper part of the plant up and down, but the reactor all the time. And in this case, you wouldn't even have to pay for the cheaper part of the plant. It would already be there maybe for free for you, or for a very small amount of money. That, I think, is something that's going to happen, but the more common repowering option will be more of a repurposing option, where you probably do not reuse the steam turbines. I think that would be more of a the golden diamond example of it. I think more commonly you will reuse maybe the condenser cooling systems and permits in the power grid connection.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I want to sort of open. I'm trying to go to some of the questions that we've got here online. I'm trying to find a couple that I might be able to synthesize. So I am going to go straight to this one. While there seems to be increased awareness that nuclear power will be key to achieving net zero globally, institutions such as IEA showing doubling of power nuclear is needed. I think it's sort of another broader question about increasing the number of taxonomies, including nuclear power, in the list of sustainable activities. What is preventing financial institutions, including multilateral development banks or private sector institutions, from investing in nuclear projects? I mean, is it inertia? Is it fear? Is it both? And if it changes, is it going to change overnight, or is it something that's going to take a while to sink in? I'm going to open it up to the group. Anybody want to take that one on?
I can take the first crack at that, because I feel like I deal with this question almost on a daily basis. I think there are two things, for international institutions, but also for individual ones. There really is an anti-nuclear bias. There's an anti-nuclear bias within the financial community, and it's because the financial community has never really looked at financing nuclear. It's always been government financed, or it's been financed on the balance sheets of large utilities. So because they don't know it, they don't understand it, they don't have any technical capability to assess it currently, it's much easier to be anti-nuclear. In addition, in the multinationals, there certainly are anti-nuclear voices that are very powerful and are outsized for the share of their voting. But the second issue is the track record, especially in the West, of delivering nuclear just hasn't been great. Banks don't like to take risks, and nobody wants to look at projects that they believe are going to be over budget and delayed by several years. So SMRs have the potential to change that. All the projects based on existing technologies and proven ones have the potential to change that. But until we demonstrate it, I think financial institutions are still going to kind of shy away a little bit.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks. Anybody else want to jump in on that, or else we'll move on? I do just want to make one quick program note. We are approaching the top of the hour. We've only gotten through one or two of our questions. And so to our audience, I want to say, and as long as our panelists are available, maybe we can extend 5 or 10 minutes just to get a couple more questions in. If you've got a meeting at the top of the hour, don't worry, we'll be recording this, and it'll be available to people after the fact. So thank you for joining. So another question from the chat. So for new nuclear nations, mostly African nations, how many years will be needed to develop the nuclear workforce? How many professionals will they need in country? I think it's a sort of a larger question. I mean, you see Kenya and Ghana, they tend to be pretty consistent participants in the IAEA process. I think they've set out dates that are sort of 2034, 2038. Is it realistic to think that at the pace they're working now, they can hit their marks? Is there anything else that the developed world can do to help accelerate developing nations with their plans? Again, Alina, this may come to you, but I want to give others an opportunity. All right, Alina, it's up to you.
All right. Well, I think it's very difficult to put a number on it. And there was a little bit of tension between the localization goals and reality. Certainly if you have a country like the UAE that has the financial resources to be able to create universities, to be able to train workforces and import the best of expats, right? Team A from every country that has nuclear, the UAE is imported. And they're in a very different position than the Kenyas and Ghanas of the world. I think there's going to be a need to really have some regional capabilities in those countries because it's also unclear how fast these programs are going to move. And really rely on some of the expat support. I think some of it can be funded by the exporting countries to begin with, but at the same time developing that workforce capability in those countries. So I don't think it's going to happen overnight. There have been things that we've been working on, for example, with CATF on this idea of an international technical support organization that would support regulators in these countries while they ramp up the capabilities to actually license the reactors. So lots of mechanisms can be deployed, but it's certainly a big challenge.
Yeah, thanks. Karl, this one is probably for you, but others, again, feel free to chime in. And I'm going to try to synthesize a couple of questions here. But, a couple of questions about the ability of the world's electrical grids to be able to accommodate renewable generation percentages, say, in excess of 50%. Somebody questioned is there enough copper in the world to make the wind turbines that we need? I guess let me sort of ask it maybe a slightly different way. We see again and again in reports that once you get to a certain point where you have an installation of a penetration of renewables that you get, I'm going to use an American football term, sort of past the 50-yard line, right? And you're the need for clean, non-emitting baseload is critical to ensure the reliability of the grids. And if you're going to do it, nuclear seems to be the lowest cost way of doing it in sort of those high penetration scenarios. Do you think that, how widely appreciated do you think that is in the IPCC report? And is this just a matter of, again, getting people to do the math and put their, suspend their politics for a moment and really look at things from sort of a pure problem solving scenario? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Sure. Really, really good question. And without a real firm bedrock answer. Couple things. First, I'd like to flag for people something called box 6.8 in chapter 6 of the IPCC report, which talks about the challenges of 100% renewable systems. They lay out some of the concerns that you just noted, which are also consistent with concerns laid out by authors at our own National Renewable Energy Lab, who have concluded that there's no reason to try to push to 100% renewable electricity or overall energy systems. You run into reliability issues, you run into affordability issues. Now, that being said, the question of how high we can take renewable penetration is basically, number one, partly unknown and partly very context specific. We know we can get up to 40, 50%. We've seen some countries do that. We might be able to get up 60, 70, 80%, but we don't want to bet the farm on getting that high or going beyond. We want to bring along all of the integration steps needed. We need more transmission to aggregate solar and wind over a broader geographic area. We need more sophisticated load demand to be able to move demand toward times of abundant solar and wind. We need developments on the battery front to go beyond 2 or 4 hour lithium batteries. And most importantly, we need multiple options for clean, firm power to balance this. And right now, it doesn't matter if we ultimately get to 50% renewable or 80% renewable. We're a long way away. What we need to do is make sure we have all the options fully commercialized, and then let the economics and technical factors drive how that grid evolves in the future.
Yeah, thanks. Well, and just one final question. maybe a little bit out of left field, but a question specifically about fusion. And I think that, fusion is something that I think everyone would agree is still really in the, is moving from the realm of physics to engineering, but it's anyone's guess at this point when we might see, commercial fusion plants connected to the grid. But let me ask sort of a broader question to all of our representatives. Have you seen the advances in fusion and the net out that NIF experienced last year and sort of the progress on that? Have we seen that change the conversation about nuclear and climate reduction in any meaningful way yet?
Well, I don't know what qualifies as meaningful, but I did see Bono of U2 go out the other day to it seems to have convinced him at least that both fusion and fission is now part of the solution, although his excitement was higher for fusion. What I've seen in the investment world is a huge rush. I mean, like never before, for sure. Venture capital investors is almost, you have to have one play in that space now. Not as much in fission, but fission is also popular, but fusion is extremely popular. So there is a change in the discussion around fusion.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
To me, they're kind of on parallel tracks, fusion and fission, and I think they have different kind of interests, as Staffan mentioned, from the investment community and those that are trying to deploy it. I think fusion, just given the state of technology readiness, is really best suited for countries that are very technologically advanced, right? Where fission is much broader as far as its deployment. And I just think they have different interests, but certainly having both would be the ideal scenario.
Yeah, I want to tack on and just connect this to, what Karl, you said. I think climate policy and clean energy infrastructure planning isn't one and done. We want to continuously innovate and really find additional solutions. I think fusion, super hot rock geothermal are solutions that are more visionary technologies into the future, right? And there is key steps that we can take to commercialize from low carbon power options like nuclear, fission, or fossil with carbon capture and storage today. So I think that we need to take those opportunities where they make sense and where communities want them. And then I think the last piece that I want to leave kind of this conversation with, going back to you, Karl, is also, right, the renewable energy expansion has happened during a time where interest rates were as low as never before, where there was a really amenable environment. And it will also get harder the more renewables we're trying to build, particularly in those places that are already saturated, because it has a large infrastructure footprint, thinking of Europe, which is densely populated. So I think we don't want to discount the complexities of climate and the energy transition as an infrastructure problem. And so want to really think through how multiple solutions fit together, as this is kind of the last thing that I would say on this webinar, thinking about it as a systems problem.
Well, Lee, I think you've sort of summed up the conversation perfectly. I want to thank all of our panelists here today for participating. Thank you very much. I also want to thank our audience, remind people that you will get an email that will provide a link to the recording of this. Share it with your friends and neighbors. And we'll be doing more of these events in the weeks and months ahead. Also a reminder that we will be having our annual winter meeting, the American Nuclear Society meeting in Washington, D.C., November 13th through 15th. I may have those dates wrong, but you know where to find it, ans.org. So thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.